Welcome back. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're going to look at yet another Microbrand diver. However, before you roll your eyes, comment about how the market is already too saturated, then inevitably change to something else, this is one I think you should know about, as I think it's going to be one of the more interesting releases for the year, as it's not only a great diver in its own right, but also represents a step up in refinement for the brand, as well as it's one of the very first watches to ever utilize a brand new Swiss movement. This is the brand new Spearfish from Zelos, and under that dial beats the new G100 movement from the Joux Perret, which not only maintains a higher 28.8 beat rate, but also a reported 68-hour power reserve. So there's a lot to talk about with this one, and we might as well just jump into it. However, before we do, I do need to let you know that Zelos did give this watch to the channel, and as far as I know, they're not going to ask for it back, hence the promotional tag at the beginning. Also, this watch is launching on February 15th, so if it's not already out, and if it is already out, it's probably sold out, then it will be shortly. That said, let's get to it. For this one, Zelos decided to keep it a little smaller and sleeker, with a width of 40 millimeters, as well as a lug-to-lug of 47, which should be a great fit for a wide variety of people. And personally, I think it wears true to that 40 millimeter width, even if the bezel is a little smaller than that. In terms of thickness, it's also looking pretty good, as I measured a total of 12 millimeters. And that is going from the flat sapphire of the crystal all the way to the sapphire on the exhibition caseback. It also has 200 meters of water resistance, a signed screw-down crown, 20 millimeter lug width, as well as a total weight of around 152 grams on its bracelet, depending on how you size it. The case and the bracelet have also been treated with an extra scratch-resistant coating, something I'm pleased to see more and more of. And of course, it's also utilizing that brand new Swiss-made movement, the GP100, which we will talk about more later on. All in all, when you look at the specs on this one, it really seems like it's trying to hit that Goldilocks zone for most people, where it's not too big, too small, or too heavy, but overall just feels right on the wrist. And that's something that they have succeeded at here. On my 7¼ inch wrist, it sits squarely in the middle with no overhang, as well as having a nice balanced feel on that bracelet. It also weighs enough that it feels like a good quality timepiece in the hand, yet it's also one that you can easily wear all day. And a lot of that comfort is also thanks to the bracelet. With female end links and smaller fully articulating links, it easily conforms to the natural curvature of your wrist. If the Spearfish looks a little familiar to you, there's a good reason for that, as it's actually based on Zelos' Swordfish line. The Swordfish line is one of the longest running in Zelos' history. I've seen a couple in the past, and I've always thought of it as the foundation for their fan base, as it really is one of the best affordable microbrand divers out there. For the Spearfish, they took the basic design of the 40mm Swordfish, and then refined almost every aspect of it to be more in line with that new movement, as well as the price tier that would eventually come along with it. So the case shape here is similar to that Swordfish, but where the Swordfish has a blocky angular exterior, which I think is reminiscent of a Seiko Samurai, the angles of the Spearfish have been smoothed out a bit, creating a smoother, streamlined appearance. I know there are some people out there who prefer the blockier look of the Swordfish. Just like with Seiko fans, there are some that prefer the Samurai over the Turtle. And for them, these changes are going to be a negative. But personally, I always like the smoother, streamlined case of the Mako versus the Swordfish. And what they've done here with the Spearfish is a nice in-between. The majority of the case here is a brushed 316L stainless. But the sides of the case have a polished chamfered edge that runs down each side, as well as on the inside of the lugs, which as a whole still lets the Spearfish maintain an overall tool watch appearance. Yet it still adds those touches that draw you in and play with the light. At the right, you have a signed screw-down crown nestled in between the crown guards, which winds up being just about the perfect size for the watch, sticking out just enough that it's always easy to unscrew and use. On the back, we have a simple brushed finish with a screw-down exhibition caseback. And note here that the caseback has a sapphire crystal, which really isn't necessary, but is always nice to see. For some, the exhibition caseback is going to be a negative, as any watch that wants to be considered a serious diver needs to have a closed caseback. But the Spearfish, as it is already pretty thin. And if you're going to have a brand new movement that no one's ever seen before, you might as well let them see it. Back to the front, we have a flat sapphire with AR on the interior. Wearing this out and about, I would occasionally notice a little bit of glare, but overall I think it's good. As for the bezel, it's steel with a coin edge and a black ceramic insert, which perfectly matches with the dial of this particular colorway, including the orange triangle at the 12. The action of the bezel is mostly good. It's 120 click, unidirectional, and has a nice audible and tactile response as you turn it. However, this is a tad harder to turn. The coin edge gives you some nice needed grip, but it is a little smaller than the watch, and there's a bit of resistance as you try to turn it. Now, one important thing to note is that there are going to be 6 different colorways of the Spearfish, 3 of which will come with this timing bezel, but the other 3 will have a dual time 12-hour bezel that will be 60 click and bidirectional. So if you do have a preference, make sure you're paying attention when you order. And speaking of colorways, there are definitely some interesting choices here. But one thing that I noticed is that there are no normal colorways, no standard blue or black, which, if I had to guess, they decided to do just to help differentiate this from the Swordfish line, as well as really designate it as being something special. I'm sure these are going to sell out like crazy, but this may be a mistake in the long run, as not everyone wants to have something quite as adventurous. Although for me, I absolutely love this burnt orange colorway. It's just different, unique, and I fell in love with it from the first moment I saw it. And it really doesn't hurt that this is the perfect color for Texas, unless you happen to be an Aggie fan. The dial is a reflective, orange textured sunburst with a fume gradient that goes to black at the very outer edges, which helps to bring that black ceramic bezel into the overall design. The texture here is kind of similar to what Seiko does with their cocktail time watches, but the indentations aren't quite as fine as they are there. It has more of a thicker texture to it. It's truly amazing to see this dial play with the light, because at any given point in time, it goes from looking like a sunset on your wrist, to a handmade copper plate, to a sunflower in a Van Gogh. It really all depends on the light, the angle, and whether or not it's close enough for you to make out that textured pattern. I, for one, absolutely love this, but I understand that it's not necessarily going to be for everyone, which is why I think it's a mistake they didn't have any standard blue or black. There is the full lumed version, but that's not necessarily a normal colorway. So take a look at the options and really just go with your gut when you're watching this. Moving to the outer edge, we have the applied polished indices that are sitting right at the transition point between the orange and black coloring. The indices here are wedges, but with very sharp polished defined angles. Compared to other watches in this price range, I think they are exceptionally done, adding even more visual depth to the design. And if the sunburst pattern wasn't enough to really draw your eyes right to the center, then the crosshair effect created by the 12, 3, and 6 will ensure it. Also, be aware that in most situations, the hands, the indices, and the bezel will have a faint green glow to it, and that's just due to the sheer amount of C3 lume used. When I showed this off on Instagram, there were a few people that commented they didn't like the green with the orange dial, but I think green is probably a better choice than a blue glow. Now, just beyond that, you have a painted chapter ring sitting in between the wedge indices, as well as a similar handset to what the Swordfish utilizes. But here, just like they did with the case, Zelos refined those hands a bit, making them more slimmer and more streamlined in order to match that case. And just like the indices, they've also gained a nice polished angular edge, helping them to brilliantly stand out and making them easier to read. I think the hour hand here may be a tad short for the design, but overall, I do like what they've done here with the hands, and especially the orange tip of the second hand, which vibrantly stands out as it circles the dial. Looking at the top, you have an applied Zelos logo, which is fairly standard for their watches these days, as well as a very minor amount of text at the bottom, and both of those do tend to get overpowered by the sunburst effect. Then, just above the 6, you also have a small date window. There's always strong opinions about a date, but this is my preferred position for it, as it really doesn't disrupt the symmetry, and in this particular instance, it actually seems to enhance the crosshair effect. The date has some nice framing, and the black date wheel here is a great choice, at least for this particular colorway. With the others, it might be debatable. Over the years, Zelos has refined the Swordfish line, going through a number of revisions just to improve its looks and functionality. The Spearfish seems to take everything they've learned from the Swordfish and then evolve it into something that retains the same functionality, but with a look that stands on its own. All in all, it's a fantastic design. But what's a good dive watch without good Lume? And in that regard, I have some good news and a little bit of bad. First off, Zelos uses a combination of X1 grade C3 and BGW9 in the design. Basically, everything here has a green glow from the C3 except the second hand as well as the chapter ring, which while short-lived, looks fantastic. But what's left here is nice and bright, and it does seem to go the distance. In terms of longevity, it's also good. Here I have it paired up with a Seiko Turtle, the newer Phoebus Kraken, and a Zelos Abyss. As you can see, the Spearfish keeps up and barely outlasts a Seiko Turtle. However, if you look at the other two watches, that's where the little bit of bad news comes in. The Spearfish has good Lume, make no mistake about it, and it should last you through the night just like any good Seiko. But unfortunately, it's not crazy good like I've seen from some of their other watches. So it is respectable, but maybe a little bit disappointing. So I was hoping for something a little bit more. And honestly, that may not be surprising considering that this does have a smaller dial with slimmer streamlined hands and indices. So there's only so much surface area to go around. Alright, so let's talk movement. The Spearfish utilizes a G100 movement from LJP. And from what I know, it's one of the very first watches to ever come with that. Now, I'm no expert in movements, and if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, I'll have a link down below that has a breakdown of the movement. But the main thing to know here is that it is a Swiss-made movement by Joux Perret, LJP, and it was designed from the get-go to be a drop-in replacement for the ETA 2824, as well as all of its respective clones. It's a higher beat, 28,800 beats per hour movement with hacking and hand winding, as well as that reported 68-hour power reserve, one of the movement's biggest selling points. Now, if you've never had a watch with an extended power reserve, that may not sound like a lot. But I can tell you from first-hand experience, it is nice. It's nice to take the watch off Friday night and then just put it on Monday morning without having to set it. For the Spearfish, Zelos opted to give it a higher grade movement, as well as they also gave it a gunmetal gray finish and an upgraded tungsten rotor. Now, every specific movement is going to be a little bit different. That's just the nature of automatic watches. It's always the luck of the draw. But in the short amount of time I've had this one, I've been fairly happy with it. Seeing an observed accuracy around -1 seconds per day, as well as actually getting 68 hours of power after wearing it for a few days. Although, since I've only had it for a short period of time, I wouldn't say that's an exhaustive test. Ideally, I would like to put this movement more through its paces, but I wanted to get this review out before the launch. So if performance with this brand new movement is something you're concerned with, I'd suggest you go check out some of the other reviews and see what they're saying about it. Also, just because they say it's a drop-in replacement for the 2824 doesn't mean that it's actually based on the 2824. It just means that it's been designed to have the same dimensions and use the same hands. In fact, I ran across a few forum posts on WatchUseek, where some people were suggesting it looks more like a Myoda 9015 than at a 2824, which in a lot of ways actually makes a lot of sense, as Joux Perret is actually owned by Citizen. Normally when it comes to brand new movements, I'm a bit hesitant, as I think most people should be. But the fact that Citizen is ultimately behind this, and that they have a ton of experience with movements, as well as some rather deep pockets to make sure things are done right, does give me a bit more confidence with this one. As for the bracelet, well, first off, I think it looks fantastic with the watch. As well as with its shorter, fully articulating links and female end links, it's extremely comfortable. The bracelet has a mostly brushed design, except for the very polished exterior edges, which winds up creating an engaging visual line that guides your eyes right towards the dial. As you would expect, you have solid links secured with screws, solid female end links that have a quick release, as well as a good milled clasp with quick adjust. Although, I think from a design perspective, that clasp does appear to be a bit thick compared to the sleek design of the bracelet. Overall, it's a great bracelet, but I did have a few minor issues with it. First off, sizing it was a little bit of a pain. The screws securing the links are rather small, and on occasion they would be a bit hard to screw back in. When I sized this, most of the screws went back in pretty easily, but there are two that were a complete pain. They just didn't seem to want to sit right as I was screwing them back in. So just a lot of trial and error backing them out and retrying it until they finally did. The other issue is with the quick release end links. They are pretty easy to take off, but on one particular side, they just didn't want to go in right. So once again, just a lot of trial and error, figuring out just how to get everything lined up. Overall, it's a great concept, but maybe a little bit more refinement is needed here just to make them easier to use. All in all, I think the Spearfish is a clear winner. There are a few areas here I would like to see some improvements upon, but for the most part, they're rather minor. The only factor that really brings some uncertainty into this equation is in terms of value, and I think this is something that's going to be highly debatable among fans. Since this is a new movement, it's really going to be hard to say how much that factors into the price, as well as find a true apples-to-apples comparison. The Spearfish is launching on the 15th with a price of $649 for the regular models, and then a little bit more for the carbon fiber or meteorite dial versions. And note that that is a special for the launch. Typically, it'll stay that way for about a month, and then the price will go up. But personally, I'll be surprised if it ever gets to that point. I think these are going to be sold out way before then. After all, this is Zelos we're talking about. Anyway, let's get back to whether or not this watch is actually worth it. If I take the movement completely out of the equation for a moment, and I then compare this to other watches I've seen, and more importantly bought at that price, I'd say the value is rather fair. There are some areas here, such as the dial and the indices, that I think the Spearfish excels at. But there's also some areas that I think could be improved upon, like say the case finishing. So on average, I'd say it's on par with those other watches. Now, factoring that movement back in, and I think the value proposition rises, and potentially rises significantly, so I would say that it's worth it. But just as important, you wind up with a watch that right now is truly unique in the marketplace. I mean, there's plenty of watches out there under $1,000 with an extended power reserve, one that goes beyond 40 hours. However, all the ones that I know about lower their beat rate to accomplish this. Typically, if you want a watch with a higher 28.8 beat rate, as well as an extended power reserve, you're going to have to start looking at luxury level watches. Yet, it's not just the utility aspect that makes a Spearfish great, as this is a watch with beauty as well as brains. The design is both breathtaking and visually interesting, while still being very functional as the hands and indices all stand out with clear defined divisions. The Spearfish is a watch evolved, not just from the Swordfish, but for the brand as well, as I think it truly shows how far Zelos has come. The Spearfish is easily the best watch I've seen from Zelos, and I think its combination of functionality, utility, and looks could make it the perfect microbrand diver. Which is also why it's a bit unfortunate that they didn't make any normal blue or black colorways, as I think that's what most people would want in an everyday watch. But what do you guys think of the Zelos Spearfish? And specifically, what do you think of that new movement? Does this movement make this watch the perfect microbrand diver, or would you like to see that movement in something else? And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.